I think we could fairly say that John White's watercolors are an example of an artifact in American studies that balances the American preoccupations with individualism and communalism. I want to stress that because when I talk about cultural tensions, I don't want you to think of them as binaries, either ors, where you have to pick one end or the other, but in fact as spectrums along with or against which these artifacts interact. So an artifact can represent one end or the other of the spectrum, or it can explore both and even very deliberately try to balance both. So let's look at a couple illustrations from White that might drive home my point. This is one of the most famous of his watercolors, and it's clearly a celebration of the heroic dignity of a Native American man, an Algonquin male. There's all sorts of interesting details. The hair that's shaved on one side of the head so that his hair won't get caught in his bow and arrow when he's using it. The elaborate body painting. Some critics have pointed out there's some scarring on his chest and abdomen that they believe are signs of bloodletting, which was a Native American curative, and by the way, a curative used back in Shakespearean England, which is the contemporary period of this image. The puma tail, which is probably an indicator that he was a tribal chieftain, and then all the little personal ornaments on his ears and his hair that really individualize him, and probably also mark him as having a higher class status in his Native American community, or a higher place of responsibility in his Native American community. And finally, it's interesting to note the way that White views Native Americans through a European lens. Many cultural critics have commented on how this is a classic European pose of male authority and nobility. So it's likely that White either had his subjects pose or drew them in these poses, regardless of whatever pose they were in, because that sort of reflected the European ideology worldview that he had of masculinity and individuality. So I think this is a really good example of a work of White's watercolors that celebrates individualism and explores the richness of individuality and of the individual's place in social hierarchies. This is a similar representation of a Native American, but this time it's a female, and she's believed to be the wife of a chief or a werewance, as is noted here in the inscription. What's very interesting about her is that she matches Harriet's description of the women very closely. The way he describes their eyes, their noses, and their hair, their height, and their clothing. Also, she's got some pretty elaborate body painting, including a body painted version of a necklace on her chest. She too seems to have been put in sort of a classic European pose. Although it's interesting that this pose, often associated with modesty among women of privilege, is not used here to cloak or hide the woman's breasts, because one of the things that Harriet and White were disturbed by and struck by was the nakedness of Native Americans, in particular from the waist up. I find it interesting to think about this topic right now because the right of women to appear in public naked from the waist up is now sort of a controversy in the United States. In fact, I was just listening last week to NPR about a story of women in, I believe it was New Hampshire or Vermont, who were appearing at a public beach or pool topless as a way of asserting the unfairness that men could be in public topless and women couldn't. Well, clearly in northern Carolinian Algonquin culture, men and women were equal in terms of their nakedness from the waist up. So there's an interesting sort of cultural twist to think about there. So we looked at individualism, so clearly demonstrated in those two earlier images, but also two of the most important images of the collection are Harriet's depictions of communal structures. And I put the various captions on this, the inscribed language of this image on the side so you could read it there. But this is a fascinating drawing. You know, we've got a religious ceremony over here. We have over here some kind of fire-related gathering. Harriet refers to these at various points as victory or celebration parties. There's some meal preparation going on over here. And then we see different kind of structures, mat-based houses, and then the cornfields, of course. So this is a very elaborate depiction of the cultural dynamics in play. And clearly, Harriet was very interested, Harriet and White were very interested in the communal dynamics here. And this would be a radically different view of community than what would be experienced in England, even in the English countryside. This is a very different look than what you would see there in terms of the structure of homes, the arrangements of the homes, the different social and agricultural patterns going on here. So this is clearly a very careful and deliberate look at community and communalism in early America that would be very different from the same ideas in their English context back in the old world of Europe. Finally, one last picture to look at. I find this one particularly interesting. Again, you have the sort of fire ceremony ritual experience there. Here it's kind of interesting because we have some Iroquoian longhouses in here. And I've read in various places, including Kim Sloan's analysis, that this is the furthest south they've ever been observed. I think Sloan believes this is a temple structure. We can look into some of the longhouses and see the rows of beds and places for people to sit. So again, this is another study of community. People gathered in small groups, engaged in various tasks. This is another examination of community that seems to be celebrating a Native American communal structure, but also a structure that's sort of more organized and more defensive than the other structure in sort of recognizable European senses of those of those words. So when we look at these images of whites in their totality, we see a really strong mix of explorations of individual identity and the individual person, male and female, and also explorations of communal sensibilities. And I see that as a very natural balance that occurs when an outsider, in this case a colonizer, watches, documents, almost anthropologically studies a group of natives, in this case North Carolina Algonquin Native Americans. So I hope this is an example for you of, first of all, some really cool and interesting drawings that offer some cool insights into this culture, but also of the way an artifact can work as on multiple levels at the same time. Thanks for your attention. I know this was one of the longer videos. I appreciate your patience, and I'll see you in Blackboard.